In this session, we're going to look at ReQlogic, which is a tool that sits on top of our NAV and AX applications to enable employee productivity. So what we'll figure out is, well, what is ReQlogic? We'll look at some of the high-level features, and then I'll do a quick run-through of a couple of transactions. There'll be a slide at the end where you can direct additional questions. So what is ReQlogic? Well, in this session, you'll learn what ReQlogic is and why you would want to deploy it. It has been around since 2002, and we have over 700 companies around the world using it, with upwards of 40,000 individual users. Ultimately, it's designed as a tool to save your company money and time in terms of efficiency, and of course time translates back to money too. Effectively geared towards any purchases or expenses that you have in general, so saving time and money in both those areas. ReQlogic is entirely web-based and browser-independent, supporting multiple web portals. Now, if you're interested in getting a little bit more technical information, I will share some of this contact information with you later on, and you can direct your questions there. First thing we'll do is we'll look at a 60,000-foot overview of ReQlogic. Basically, it's all about getting approval for expenditure. So the idea is that a user would enter a transaction, and there are different kinds of transactions you can initiate from anywhere in the world, and they would submit it for review. Based on the criteria that the workflow rules have been based on, different reviewers will get the transaction, and they can either approve it, reject it, or edit it if they have permissions. And they can do that via their browser, the actual email notification, or their smartphone. And then the end goal really is to take these approved transactions and create either purchase orders or accounts payable vouchers in the underlying ERP system, either Dynamics NAV or Dynamics AX. And then that information is sent back into the ReQlogic transaction that creates it. So we have that two-way communication. So once again, there are 4 different types of transactions. Requisitions, which will go on to create purchase orders. Vendor invoices, where you want to process the invoice through the ReQlogic interface, and it can go for approval there versus sending it directly into NAV or AX. And then we have reimbursable employee expenses. Again, you can set up business rules, as we'll talk about later. But the ultimate goal is to create an AP transaction in the underlying ERP system and then pay the employees. And then finally, there's also a goods receipt process that can be initiated through the ReQlogic interface. So it's an excellent idea where you want people to be accountable for receiving their own goods or services. So the accounts payable department doesn't have to come back and ask them where their goods and services are, or if they've received them, particularly when the invoice comes in for payment. Now, some other features of the application, this is just the tip of the iceberg really, but some highlights I wanted to point out. First of all, ReQlogic tightly integrates with Microsoft Dynamics so that the data, and in this case perhaps GL accounts, vendor IDs and dimensions, the data is all maintained in one place, and that is the Dynamics database. ReQlogic is just reading that data. The other thing is that the data is validated in real time as it's being entered into ReQlogic via the ReQlogic interface. And now, just to draw your attention to 3 of the major differentiators with ReQlogic, why it would be very useful and efficient to deploy. First is that the visibility that users enjoy with respect to their own transactions. They can see where they are at any point in time through their life of the transaction, from its first creation through to the payment of that invoice. They can supplement this visibility with select email notifications that are generated by various events. Next is the ease of use which the transaction entry screens can be tailored to the particular individual or to a role, making it as easy as possible for the user community to use. And then finally is the powerful and very easy to configure workflow that the transactions follow, which can be designed to suit your individual company's needs. So whether that's an authorization hierarchy by amount only, or a combination of amount, expense category, GL account, dimension code, you can even incorporate user-defined values. And these are just a few of the options available to you. The advanced routing is worth talking about some more, actually, and this is because you can have an unlimited number of approval levels, entirely flexible. They could be nested. They could be nested within each other. You can have them set up so that they're sequential or in parallel, and there are multiple different Route 2 options. So that is fairly powerful stuff. Now, before we get actually into the presentation, here is the information, or you can get some more. You can go to the ReQlogic website. You can contact Ross directly, or here is a generic email address for ReQlogic where you can go post your question for more information. So at this point, I am going to get out of the slideshow and begin the transaction. So now here is the ReQlogic homepage. We've actually logged in as a person called Amanda Gardner. And I'm doing this, happen to do this against my Dynamics AX database. It looks exactly the same when I do it against NAV. The home page is telling the person, it's the person's current activity. It's the most recent activity with the most recent transaction at the top. This particular view is entirely customizable, as is many of the views and lookups within ReQlogic, out of the box using, in this case, the view definition screen. The view itself, so it could be modified to add or remove columns, basically. And here we can see a summary of recent transactions with the status. So it's probably the most important thing on this screen would be the description of the transaction. This would be a description on the header that helps the person find it to see what the status is, or perhaps it would also be useful to the various managers when they're approving it, and then the status of the transactions. So you can see on the transactions menu, like I said, lots of different transaction types. You've got requisitions, which you can either enter or import. We have employee expenses, which they can be entered manually. They can be imported. And there's a third option where receipts can actually be emailed to a particular ReQlogic email address, and that will actually start. It'll either start a new expense report or it will add to an existing expense report. Then we can have invoices. Similarly, with invoices, you can either enter the whole thing manually through the ReQlogic screen. You can import great big files, like perhaps a credit card file or the mobile phone file for several mobile phone accounts. And then finally, you also are able to have the vendor email a copy of the invoice to a specific email address in ReQlogic, and that will either create a new transaction under the vendor invoice heading, and it will create the header, and you just have to fill in the details. Okay, so that's enough about the transactions. You'll also notice that they each have their own little icons. So from my home page here, I can see that my most recent transactions, I have a requisition for a new employee in the finance department. I have an expense report. There's an invoice for a mobile bill, which was rejected for some reason. I would have to go in and see what that was about. There's comments that the approvers can make. And then I can see various home office supplies. This is another requisition that went all the way to purchase order. Then I have an example of an invoice. This example of this invoice was processed. And let's see, we have an invoice. We have an example here of an invoice. Yes, that was processed. An expense report that was processed as well. So we'll look at those in detail. But what I want to show you is, let's start by entering a transaction. So I've started a transaction here, and I've attached some notes and some documents to it. The documents can be drilled back into from the original, when the requisition, once the requisition or the purchase order, has been created, either in AX or NAV. And any given requisition can give rise to multiple purchase orders, because we can have a different vendor on every line, or a different project on every line. So what I'm going to do now is start adding lines to this particular transaction. So for example, when I go to create a new line, we can see that there are quite a few fields here. Again, out of the box, I'm able to modify the look and feel using my parameterization or customization menu. I'm able to decide what fields are required, perhaps some default values, like these 2 dimension values here are being defaulted. I also can determine what fields are required. Out of the box, only 2 fields are required. That would be the description and the quantity. So in that particular case, I have to provide these values, because if I try to save the line without the values, it's going to complain. So I need to put those in at the very minimum. So what I could do is I could say I need a new key for the office door for the new hire. I've got to put in at least 1 because the quantity is required, and then I can put in a general note. So the general note will be telling the various approvers why I'm getting this. I'll pretend I can type. Okay, and to be honest, nothing else is required, so I'm going to leave it blank. So I can save this line and create a new line. Now on the second line, I'm going to be prompted for an expense category. Now, it could be that it's an item from my item master in my underlying ERP system, if I'm buying sort of direct items via ReQlogic, or it could be a non-stock item or a service that I retain in my ReQlogic catalog. And that is so that my users don't have to think too much about what GL account to use or what dimension to use. So for example, I have several items in my ReQlogic catalog. One of them is a laptop. I can also set things to be favorites. So for instance, if I decide that I'm going to be buying quite a few laptops for the new hire, we're on a hiring binge, I'm going to order some office supplies and some training. So I've added those to my favorites. So then rather than going through the item master every time, I can go through the favorites. And similarly, I can get rid of them. And then if I did want to choose one of these items, I can choose it either from the master list, from the favorites list, or I can start to type in the ID if I know it, and it will find something. Similarly, it's going to validate that data for me. If I didn't know the item ID, but I thought I did, let's say I want to buy a PC, well, it's actually telling me that that is not a valid value. So anywhere we see these magnifying glasses, we're validating the data against, for the most part, the underlying database. So I happen to know that I want to buy this laptop for the new gal. And then I can put in, however many, whatever description I want here. For example, I'm going to say I want it to be less than £2. So that's going to be a very, very special computer indeed. You'll notice that when I tabbed off that field, it brought in some default values that are associated with that item. For example, the GL account. That can be quite handy, especially if you're doing budget checking, because you don't want the end users, they probably don't have a clue what GL account to charge it to, and it's one less place it has to stop on its route to becoming a purchase order if nobody has to pause and enter the GL account. So that's why I've defaulted that there. Now again, you could make it so that it's read only, and Amanda here has no choice but to have it go to 606-300. If she does have a choice, we can give her a limited selection of GL accounts from which to choose. And that's all part of the configuration. So it depends on the access rights the person has. And then finally, I do need to provide that value. And there's nothing else required. So quite frankly, I can save this line. And so the other way we can, and one other way we can add a line to our requisition would be to connect to the vendor's website. That's called punch-out technology. And even though we're giving the person the right to go there, they're not actually placing a purchase order. They're just simply choosing items, putting them into a shopping cart, and then they'll check out. It looks something like this. So what's happening now is my authentication information, my ID, and a unit of my password, and the specific URL where all of our contract prices are maintained is where I'm going. And I'm going to search for, I might have some favorites, but let's say I'll search for, to go with the laptop, maybe I need a laptop bag. I'll pretend I can type again. I'll do a search for that. Now, even though it looks like I've left ReQlogic and I'm definitely in a different place, what we're looking at is our contract prices for these bags. And again, you don't have to do this. This is just an option. It's available for some vendors. So you would choose the item you want. You think you might get away with the price, and then you would check out. But when you check out, what's really happening is you're simply, ReQlogic is simply taking the contents of your shopping cart, which is this one item, and dumping it into ReQlogic as the third line item in this particular requisition. And that site must be busy. So we have two different, in our requisition, we have two different line items. So what we'll do is we'll submit it for review. So we're happy enough with those two. And now it's telling me my document has been submitted. So I can tell that the status has changed. So if I were to come in and look at that to see, well, where is my requisition at this point in time, I can see it's in routing. And what that means is somebody in the approval process is working on it. If I wanted to see exactly where it is, I would go to the status tab, and I can see here on the status tab everything since I created it up until the manager approving it. Now, there could be multiple managers. There could be based on the commodity, based on the dollar amount, etc., like I mentioned earlier, and it's all based on the routing policy, which the end user really has no control over. It's where most of your consulting effort would go. Now, as far as the manager approving this thing, she can do it through a number of different ways. She could log in to what we call ReQlogic Mobile. This is simply a URL that you direct your smartphone to. It's a website, and she can see her own current activity. There's only one transaction in there, or she can see her review queue. Here are 3 different transactions. So here's the one that we just did, the new hire. So when I do it from the phone, granted it's going to scale it depending on the size of my screen, and I can see that there were 2 attachments and some general notes. So that's telling me what it's about. I can always open the attachments if I want a closer look. And then I can see there were 2 different line items. Now, my only choice here would be to either add a comment and to either approve the whole thing or reject the whole thing. But if I go into the application, let's not approve it from the smartphone. Let's instead go in as Deborah into the application itself. And when you're logged in as a manager, you'll notice your homepage here has two different groups of transactions. Your approvals at the top, which is more relevant because those are the things you need to take action on. And then your own transactions is a separate web part at the bottom. So here's the supplies from Amanda. I can see that there's some other transactions in here from other users as well. There is a quick approval option, but to be honest, I want to open it up and see. And that quick approval, all that stuff is granted by different access rights. So we've logged in as Deborah, and we're in the review mode. We're looking at this transaction in detail, and by virtue of the permissions that this approver has, she's able to approve or reject individual transactions, or she's able to edit individual transactions. So here, for instance, I could edit the line and say, well, really that's ridiculous. There's no such thing as a £2 laptop. We'll have to say less than £10, please. And we'll say, you know, Dell preferably. It's easier to type. So I've saved that, and because I was able to edit the line, I'm also able to delete lines and add new lines. And this is granted reviewer by reviewer in our routing policy. You'll also notice that this particular line has a $0 amount. It may or may not be, I might not be able to approve it depending on my permissions. I can always make comments as well to say, okay, it's approved. And other things I could do would be to forward it to somebody on the fly. That would be inserting another approver into the mix. Or if I needed more information or some guidance from somebody as to what to do, or I wanted more information from Amanda herself, I could send a message to Amanda, and all of that information would be tracked in our status tab, which we'll get to shortly. So let's go ahead and see if we can't approve this transaction. I'm not going to make any other adjustments. I'm not going to reject anything. I'm just going to say, yeah, I'm going to approve everything. And it looks like I'm able to get away with approving 0 value lines. And that's something that's a function of the routing policy. Most often you'd say, no, they have to put some value in there. So now that I've gone to the trouble of logging in, I'm brought to a screen where I can see the 2 transactions that are still for me to approve, and a whole listing of my previous transactions. Now, one of the things I forgot to do, so let me go back and show you that. I happen to know through the routing tab, as the end user, I could have found out where this transaction was going to go to. And you'll notice that there's step 1 and step 2. So I'm taking a step back. I should have looked at this probably before we submitted it, but we can also use this to see where the transaction is, how it got there, who else it's going to go to, and where it is at this particular moment. So I can see that for this transaction, based on the total amount, based on the department she belongs to, based on the commodity that she ordered, it's going to go to 2 different people, and I can see it's not going in parallel, it's going sequentially. So Tom Middleton, our IT manager, is not going to know anything about it until Deborah has taken action. So you can see that she approved. She didn't delegate it to anybody. She said okay. Her comments basically just said okay. But the second person that it was going to go to was the manager of IT. We'll see this also in the status tab. So this is just your audit trail, what's happening with this transaction as it moves along. Now, it could be that the manager of IT gets an email notification to let him know he's got something to review. So if I were to go over to my email notifications show up like they're entirely modifiable. There are emails going to the end user telling them things are approved, rejected, if they have a partial approval, when the PO has been created. So here's an example of a routing notification. You can also edit this to add attachments at the header level. And here I can see that there's my two different line items. I could either approve it or reject it from within the email. I could click details that would launch the application. And then a new feature we just added recently is that I can reply to the email, and using a predefined text like approve or approving or whatever, that will serve to approve it. So I could do this from my phone. These other options require that I be attached to the network, whereas if I just approve it, I don't have to worry about being attached to the network. So let's log back in as Tom. Now, Tom Middleton can either log in from emails, he can go in from his smartphone, but what I want to show you is one of the advantages of doing your workflow at the line level is that it's possible for a person to see all the transactions, but very, very clear about the ones that are theirs to approve. So in this case, only the laptop line is his, not the key for the door. The second thing about this particular approver is that he's not able to edit the lines or review the lines, or add new lines, rather. So if he doesn't like this, his only option would be perhaps to reject it by unchecking that flag, or perhaps he could do one of 2 things. He could send it to somebody else, forward it to someone, or return it to an earlier approver someone earlier in the review process, even if it's 2 steps or 10 steps back, with a comment as to what he'd like them to do. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and approve it. And we'll just click Review Completed. I haven't made any comments, but we saw earlier where those can occur. And now that transaction, I don't think it needed to go through any more people. It'll go to the queue of the purchasing agents whose job it is to turn it into a purchase order. And they also can add missing information and consolidate multiple requests that are coming from different people in different departments for the same vendor. They can either create one purchase order for all requests or one purchase order per site or per ship to. Amanda is probably wondering by now where her transaction is. So if we look here, you can see there's the supplies, it's approved. Great, let's have a look and see who said what and where it is at this point in time. So if we look at the status tab, I can see that as soon as I submitted it, it went to Deborah, she made a comment, she updated it. By the way, when she makes a change, depending on your workflow, that might kickstart the thing to start all over, dropping people off or adding new people on. When she approved it, having made her OK comment, the next person in the line, because it was sequential, was Tom, the IT manager. And he went ahead and approved it. He didn't have any rights other than to reject it or to send it back to somebody else. But since those were the only 2 levels of approval that were triggered from the routing policy for this particular transaction, I can see that the document is now approved. And that means that the routing is completed. The workflow is actually finished. And now what happens is these transactions are sent to the appropriate purchasing agents for them to convert into purchase orders, also via ReQlogic. And so in my workflow rules, I've actually said that anything that's non-IT goes to Bob, and anything that's IT in nature must be processed by Mary. So when they each log into their buyer review queue, they will see those transactions that are ready for processing. Now let's look at some transactions that we've processed already. Here's another example of a transaction, a requisition, I know by the icon, and it's made its way to purchase order. So let's edit that and we'll see where it is. So first of all, I can tell a lot of information from the header. I can tell that the status is purchase order. So it probably it's saying it's multiple purchase orders. It's not just one purchase order. And it's also telling me that this purchase order has been partially received. That's great information. At the line, I can see that there were 3 different transactions, and one of them has been fully received. So if I go to the receipt tab, I'll probably see that information, that line 2 was received on such and such a date. The routing is much the same as we've seen before. It's just a summary of the workflow. In this case, there were 3 people that needed to approve it. Again, it was sequential. But the status is what tells me where the transaction is. And this time, it was all sent to one purchasing agent, and that one purchasing agent went ahead and created the purchase orders. The purchase orders are created from within AX, or from within ReQlogic rather, but the actual purchase order number that gets created is created within AX, and it's assigned the next AX number in the sequence. So I can see that from this particular requisition, there were 3 different purchase orders, all created by Bob. And then I can see later on that the person who was the initiator, requester, looks like she's been able to email a purchase order and printed a copy for herself. This particular status does not stop here. The next thing that would happen is if the goods were received, I would see an event at this stage, even if Amanda is not doing the receiving. She also could have an email notification asking to be prompted when the goods are received. I'm also going to see a notification or an event when the AP voucher has been processed by accounts payable. And finally, I will see an event where the invoice has been paid. So all of that stuff is available to me in my status tab on my requisition, or through my preferences. This is a subset of my user profile, and here I can see the kinds of emails that this person has indicated she wishes to receive, and that's all possible emails. In addition to requisitions, ReQlogic also has other transaction types that we talked about. One is an invoice, or let's look at an invoice for some plumbing services. I'll notice that the status on this one is processed, whereas the status on this invoice up here is rejected. Let's look at the processed one and see what that means exactly. Again, we'll have routing, so I can see that in this particular case, because it's in this type of transaction, it's going to somebody in accounts payable after the line manager approves it, whoever's responsible for that department. Here I can see she's made some comments, she's checked it from her mobile interface, and then I can see that the accounts payable person checked the GL account and it's good to go. By the way, all of this information is available in the Status tab as well as seeing the document being fully approved, the routing being completed, and then over time, there's an event, an agent running in the background. It creates this transaction in AX, and then it sends it back, sends the reference number back as an event to my Status tab. So exactly the same idea. You have a header and you have detail line items, and then you have attachments and notes. We can also have the vendor email the invoice to us, and that would start a new transaction, giving it the next number in the sequence and attaching the actual invoice. And then all we'd have to do is add the line item, much as we did with a requisition. Finally, we have expense reports. So an expense report, for instance, it's a green icon. And here again, I can see that it's processed. Now this might be a redundant column. You could get rid of that if you wanted to. You could add more columns, like I said. Let's bring that up and see that in detail. So this happens to be a transaction that's also been converted to an AP voucher. Let's see what kind of approval it needed. So it just needed one level of approval. And again, if we look at the status, we can see everything from the point that Amanda initiated it all the way through to the approval process and the AP voucher being created. Finally, there's one more application of expenses that might be useful. For instance, if you are traveling for business and you're using your own credit card, let's use that example. We're using our own credit card, and so everything's going to be reimbursed to me. And I will put a description in because that is required at the header level. Let's say something simple like expenses from my LA trip. I live in San Francisco, so LA is around the corner. So I will click on the Browse feature, and there's certain formats that we've identified that credit card companies and banks use. So we've basically found the common denominator. And I have one called Amex download, and that's my current Amex file. So I'm going to open that up and then just click the import button. So what this allows me to do is I'm seeing all of the different transactions between date X and date Y from that credit card account. And then I just have to assign either by, again, I can click on the lookup and see the entire record. The green ones are the favorites. So this is my entire list of possible expense categories. I can go through my personal favorites, and people create their own personal favorites. So logging in as each individual user, you'd see that there would be different favorites. So let's say I have some hotel expenses. What I do is I just assign that expense to the transaction right here on the screen. So I have a couple of expenses. I also have some air. If I know the item ID, or the expense category rather, I can put that in as well. I could just simply, so it doesn't like that particular one, so we'll just leave that as is. We'll go with the 4 hotels for the moment. So when I'm ready, all I do is I click import, and then it creates a transaction. It's got a header. I probably should attach a copy of that receipt to it, or that credit card, my receipts or a statement or something, and then here are my transactions as if I'd entered them. And then if I've got some manual expenses, like I've got some mileage that I need to process, or I've got some tips or something, or meals that I paid cash for, then I would add those manually. And then again, depending on the workflow rules that apply to me, and whatever criteria I have, whatever criteria are applicable, it might need to go to different people for review. So again, it's submitted for review. Based on the rules, it would go through for approval and then ultimately become an AP voucher. So that was 3 different transaction types. The 4th transaction type is a receipt. So basically, when you're receiving, your end user probably has no idea of the requisition number or the PO number, but they might have a clue who the vendor is because it's going to be written all over the packet that just showed up on their desk. So let's say I have a vendor here from, or I have a package from Earth Televisions. This screen is showing me all of the requisitions and all of the corresponding purchase orders for Earth Televisions that have not yet been received. You can see that it can do partial receipts. Here's an example where 5 are still remaining. So 5 must have been received, and I think the most recent one would have been on June 18th, and somebody has a packing slip attached to that. And then here's a laptop computer. We could actually we'll just go ahead and receive this one. And if I click Save, it's going to do 2 things. First, it's going to update a purchase order in AX, and secondly, it's going to update my requisition by adding to the receipt tab the fact that this transaction was received, this quantity was received on such and such a date. So very tightly integrated to AX on the back end. And now, like I said in my earlier PowerPoint, what I think we should do is just, let's see, bring up the screen and make a note of the contact information if you want to add any more or ask any questions. Certainly if you wanted to schedule a more in-depth presentation based on your particular circumstances, just let Ross know. And if there are any questions that he can't answer, he'll get a hold of me. Thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciated. And I'm going to end this presentation.